Hey everyone, so today I read Matthew 4 and 5, and in these passages we see a lot of the same things that have been happening in the other parts of what we've been reading in Matthew and Luke especially, and so I'm not going to cover any of that actually, just one little part that we have seen already, but the reason there's so much commonality is because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're referred to as the synoptic gospels, and comes from the word synonym, or same root as synonym. And so think of the same, right? They're saying very similar things about Jesus, but they're ordering it in such a way that you see different aspects of who he is, right? So you have Matthew, who again is talking about Jesus as king, Mark, which we're reading today, who talks about Jesus as servant, and Luke talks about Jesus as man, and John talks about Jesus as God, right? And so John is a very different gospel. It's the same Jesus, obviously, but it's a very different rendering, very different picture of who Jesus is because it's looking at it from the top down at the life of Jesus, whereas the others are kind of looking at Jesus from the ground up, right? So they're looking at him as king, as man, as servant, right? So they're all looking from an earthly perspective, who is Jesus. And obviously, there's a lot of the divinity that we see of Jesus in these passages, such as right here that we're going to look at the end of chapter 4. But it's very cut and dry. There's more of a chronological perspective on it, whereas with John, it's all over the place. We see him burst into the temple right at the beginning of the book, which arguably happened twice, but he's the only one that mentions it at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, whereas the others only talk about it at the end. Just things like that. And then the fact that like a third of his book from John 13 through 17 is one night. Like it's all from the time that he has dinner with the guys at the Passover to the time that he's praying in the garden at like 3 a.m, and so a third of his book encompasses like 8 hours of time. And then the first like 10 or 12 chapters is like the ministry that we think of when we read the whole of the synoptic gospels. But even in there's a lot of differences between the things that he talks about and the instances that he recalls versus the ones that they're using. Because again, he's talking about him as God. They're talking about him as a man who is also God. So today we're going to look at verses 35 through 41, particularly in verse 39, right? So they get in a boat, they cross the Sea of Galilee, and they're going over to the land of the Gerasenes, right? And they're going to meet a guy who's demon possessed, and I think we talked about that a little while ago, but either way, he gets in the boat and he kind of just drifts off, finds a cushion, goes to sleep, right? Asleep on a cushion in the stern of the ship, and the disciples freak out because there's this wave and there's just stormy seas and everything. It literally describes it as a megastorm in Greek, so big deal, right? Some of these guys are experienced fishermen and they're freaking out. There's like 4 of them, and so clearly this is a big deal. But Jesus is very calm. He's at the back of the boat, and so then they're like, Jesus, help us. And he awoke. It says that in verse 39, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Why do you have so little faith? Why do you have you still no faith?" Sorry. And they were filled with great fear, and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Right. And so there's 3 different passages I want to look at that kind of speak to this idea of calming the storm, right? And so in Job 38, God is talking to Job and saying, where were you when all of these things happened, right? Because Job is questioning God and saying, why are you allowing all this bad stuff to happen? And God says, verse 38, chapter 38 of Job, verse 8, he talks about how who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, "Thus far shall you come, and no further, and here shall your broad waves be stayed." right? And so God is speaking to the oceans and saying, this is the extent of your dominion. This is how far you can go and no further. Then we see in Psalm 65, verses 5 through 7 or so, 8. By awesome deeds, you answer us with righteousness, O God of our salvation, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, the one who by his strength established the mountains, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of the peoples, so that those who dwell at the ends of the earth are in awe at your signs. You make the going out of the morning and the evening to shout for joy, right? So what's going on here? It's interesting that they are they're talking about the fact that God can do all these things, right? That He establishes the scope of the seas, but He can also speak to the roaring seas and still them, right? But it's interesting. They talk about how great is the God of our salvation, who answers us with righteousness, right? The hope of all the ends of the earth. So they're associating His ability to calm seas with his might, his power, his salvation. And then in verse 7, it says that they were compared the roaring of their waves to the tumult of the peoples, right? And so he's also saying that in this passage, like, God can still the seas, but He can also still the peoples of the earth. He can calm international conflicts. He can save His people from the attacks of the nations. And it's a very similar concept to in Psalm 46:10, where He says, "Be still and know that I am God." That isn't a verse that you should stitch on your cross pillow, because He's speaking that to the nations, to the evil nations who are refusing to bow down before Him. In the context of that passage, He's saying, "You will be still and you will know that I am God." Right? And so God is saying, just as I am able to speak and still the seas, I can also speak and still the nations as well. The bad nations that aren't doing good and aren't following me. And so then lastly, in Psalm 104, verse 5 and following, we see that He set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. Right? And so He's talking about the flood and how He allowed the waters of the earth to cover even the highest mountains. And then at your rebuke they fled. And at the sound of your thunder they took to flight, right? So He speaks, and again they're gone. And so the fact that Jesus is given this same authority shows that He is God Himself. He is not a man. He is not like Elijah. Elijah couldn't do this. Elisha couldn't do this. Moses couldn't do this. Jacob, David, all the Old Testament saints, none of them had power and authority over the winds and the wave, because they weren't Him, right? And so Jesus is given this authority to show, and uses this authority, more importantly, with His disciples to show that He is God Himself, right? That He has this authority over the winds and the waves, because He's the one who created it. But because of that, He is also the God of our salvation. He is also the one who can calm the raging and the storming of the nations. He is the one who can bring us peace and demonstrate His righteousness and His love to us. And so this is the God that we look to. This is the God that we call to in the storms of our life, in the storms of whether it be, just famine or poverty or racism or attack or slander or any other thing, right? Jesus can help us in those storms, because He's literally calmed real storms. He can calm these kind of storms even easier, right? If that is even possible for God to have anything more or less difficult, which I don't think it is actually. But all that to say that in His presence there is nautical obedience.